Welcome to my talk. It's a talk that's going to be a bit disturbing for some. It's a subject that is very dear to my heart. It's about the extinction crisis in Northern Australia, focusing mostly on mammals. I'd like first, though, to acknowledge traditional custodians and the elders past, present and emerging on the lands on which we work. And there are some 200 nations across Northern Australia where I've worked for the last 35 years. When Europeans colonised Australia, there were over 180 species and subspecies of mammals across Northern Australia. In 2015, there were 160. There's some new finds and some subspecies described since 2015. So you can see the list there: 55 species of bat and 39 species of rat and a dingo, 8 species of marsupial, and 2 species of monitoring. Oh, that one just dropped off. Oh, there's another wobbly one. When I started doing fauna surveys in Northern Australia, some of the species that we've now seen in decline were quite abundant. This is Kylie Harvey, who I worked with for many years in Northern Territory, and she's holding a northern quail, which is Dasyurus halocardus. We trapped that at gunpoint in the Northern Territory, north of Darwin, northeast of Darwin, and it's possibly the last one that was found in that area, and that was back in 2001. So that's only 20 years ago. I was also involved in quite a number of surveys with Northern Territory Parks and Wildlife and CSIRO, looking at places like the southern Kakadu region in the conservation zone, which is what it was called then. And we used to complain bitterly about the number of traps we would have to walk all the way down from the top of a dry rocky ridge down to the river to wash out traps, which had been filled with northern quail poo, and it stank. It always stank. So we'd have to take these traps all the way down the hill, wash them out, walk them all the way back up the hill, and reset them for the next night's trapping. And we'd do it again, day after day after day. In those days, we used to think that they're beautiful animals, but sometimes they'd be a bit tiresome. Now I regret not having paid it more attention because they were disappearing. Over the years, the number of species decline have been quite dramatic. For instance, the bats, 2 species are endangered now, 3 vulnerable. 39 species of rat, 2 of which are now extinct. One's critically endangered, 2 endangered, and 7 vulnerable. The dingo, uncertain. It's recent genomics show that it's quite a distinct species. It's not a dog. It's a species on its own. It's persecuted in Queensland. It's relatively secure in Northern Territory and particularly towards the deserts, and pretty okay in WA, although it is still shot and trapped and poisoned. Out of the 84 species of marsupial, there are now 2 extinct, 3 critically endangered, 13 endangered, and 7, more than 7 vulnerable. And one of the monotremes is now in danger. Oh, there's some more wobbly species there. No. Back in 2018, I was contracted by the Nature Conservancy to examine what had happened in the years since we did a paper in 2015 looking at faunal declines. And I interviewed many of the researchers who I know already in Northern Australia who've worked on fauna. And we published this paper that is the sort of the substance of this talk. And what we found was quite disturbing. It's not only are the declines significant, the gaps in monitoring leave us with a real problem. And we'll get onto that. I'd like to go into a little bit of detail because it's too short a time to cover the whole paper. You can read the paper. It's freely available in the journal Diversity. So if you want to go to that, please do. I would like to focus on two species, and this highlights some of the problems we have. The black-footed tree rat, this one here, and the northern quail. I'll go into each of these in a bit more detail so I can explain what the issues are. And the black-footed tree rat has been identified as three distinct species: the Kimberley and mainland Northern Territory species, the Melville Island subspecies, and the North Queensland subspecies, the Ratoides. Now, we have a situation where, under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the three subspecies are recognised. The Kimberley and mainland NT species are considered to be endangered now. It's an uplisting from the previous study in 2015. The Melville Island species is considered vulnerable, and the North Queensland subspecies is considered vulnerable also. I'd like you to have a look at that small section of the table. To the right, there's a column called Summed Monitoring Score. That score is a ranking of how well each species is monitored, and it's a score out of 45. So the Kimberley NT species is got about 16 out of 45 rating, which is not too bad. It's, it could be better, but it's not too bad. At least they've got some good data on the status of the black-footed tree rat in the territory in Kimberley. When we get to the Melville Island, it's slightly higher. Melville Island's been pretty well studied for a number of species, including the black-footed tree rat. But when we come across to Queensland, there's zero monitoring occurring. So we have a situation where there's a subspecies in the territory which is endangered, subspecies in Melville Island which is considered vulnerable, and in the absence of any monitoring, it's considered least concern in Queensland. I'll show you the distribution of this species because it's illustrative of the next thing we're going to talk about. The Melville Island species is essentially all on Melville Island and doesn't come to the coast. It's been considered a subspecies for a very long time. The top end species, Gouldii, which is found right throughout the top end except Melville Island, is now considered vulnerable. And the Queensland species, which is scattered along the east coast, is not monitored, and it's quite a distinct species. And you recognise in that picture that the three populations of these subspecies are very, very disparate. They're very well separated by very large biogeographic barriers. Now, come to the northern quail. Its species is Dasyurus halicartus, and under the EPBC Act, the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, it's considered endangered. And it's also considered endangered under IUCN categories and the Management Action Plan, a Mammal Action Plan, published by John Winarski and co. Back in 2014. It's considered endangered in WA, critically endangered in Northern Territory, and least concern in Queensland. But in a recent paper by Pat Woolley and colleagues, it's now been identified through genomic studies as being 4 subspecies: the Northern Territory one, the Kimberley one, Cape York one, and one in the Pilbara. Hang on. Yeah, it's a couple of wobbly species there. The description, the status of it under the EPBC Act is as endangered. And yet in Queensland, the same species that's not reduced to a subspecies, it's considered the one species, it's considered least concern. So we have a problem in that we have these very disparate populations, which I'll show you in a minute, of the 4 subspecies being very, very distinct and separated by very large barriers. And again, the monitoring varies enormously in each of those regions. The Northern Territory population is pretty well monitored because that's where the declines in mainland extinctions have been detected. So it's 20 out of 45 was enough to pick up that was in trouble. But in Queensland, it's we put that ranking of about 12 because we know of some studies that are going on, particularly around one of the wind farms where it was required to be monitored. And we know of records up on the Cape, up around Black Mountain, where they're regularly seen. So that's not like the territory where we just don't see them anymore. At least we do see them in North Queensland. In the Pilbara, we have monitoring as a result of conditions under a mining act, the Pilbara mining operations. There's quite a few happening there. And they're required to monitor, and the populations seem to be okay, but we don't have any published peer-reviewed data on that as yet. The separation of these 4 species confirms earlier suggestions that they were actually 4 subspecies. But Pat Woolley and Mark Westerman and Krajewski have clearly shown that they are 4 distinct subspecies. Oh, there's a few more species here getting in trouble. That's the spectacled flying fox just in trouble. The northern quail is distributed right across northern Australia savannas and into the desert, but its species is separated into 4 subspecies, as I mentioned, and the environments that they live in are very different. The Pilbara is it's a spinifex, rocky, sandy desert. It's very dry, very hot, and that's a separate subspecies. The Kimberley subspecies is again separate from the Northern Territory and the Pilbara subspecies. The Northern Territory subspecies is the one that's in serious trouble. It's critically endangered now under Northern Territory legislation. It's still got good populations on Groote Island, which is on the western side of the Gulf of Carpentaria. You can see there. The population's protected there from invasion by cane toads because the ranger group there prevents cane toads coming to shore. And so far they've been able to keep cane toads off. The Queensland population, right along from the tip of Cape York down the east coast, is a separate subspecies, and it is essentially unmonitored. It is picked up in some fauna surveys in the southern regions, but there's no monitoring going on apart from the wind farms and a little bit of work up on the Cape, but there's no serious monitoring of that species. Oh, the koala's just been listed as endangered too. I guess you've heard. Northern hairy-nosed wombat's a bit in trouble as well. Now, as this is a talk to a group of people who are interested in data, I thought I'd mention that the records of the northern quail that we've mapped here come from the Atlas of Living Australia. Those records go back as far as records could be found that have been entered into the Atlas of Living Australia. And yet there's a paper that came out in 2014 by Peacock and Abbott that identified a report in a newspaper of a plague of what they would call the when the native cat plagues, and it was found around the Normanton area back in 1897 in huge numbers, and it was associated with the plague of what are called plague rats or long-haired rats or the Rattus vilicissimus. And so then the northern quail was in that area at that time, and people certainly knew what northern quails were. There's no mistaking them. They come in and eat chickens and eat your eggs, just get in your houses and cause quite some havoc. So we need to be a little bit mindful of very large data sets. So we've got a situation where the 4 subspecies of the northern quail are considered to be of different status, even though They're clearly different populations and endangerment in different regions of the Northern Territory. This brings in a whole range of conservation issues in terms of distribution, reintroductions, population studies, what actions need to be taken, what the causes and effects of some of these things are. So I've got very different legislative statuses, and this is despite some efforts to homogenize status reckoning in Australian legislation. So I've got, there's another one dropped off the list. Australia's fauna extinction crisis has been known for a long time. The big extinctions happened early the previous century and late previous century and then early last century. And for the last couple of decades, we've known it's been hitting Northern Australia. And this is a bit of a surprise in a lot of ways because Northern Australia appears to be in pretty good condition. There's, the original tree cover and woodland cover is essentially there. A lot of the grasslands are still there and they look pretty well intact. But a lot of things have caused these problems, however. So the paper that alerted us to the changes in mammal populations came from John Wynarski and co. back in 2001, where they were detecting serious declines in populations of mammals in Kakadu National Park. Subsequently, the same author, John Wynarski, documented further declines. That's in 2007. And those declines were being detected in other parks and other parts of the Northern Territory as well. Then Mark Zimbecki and others got together in 2011 and documented further declines and tabulated all these changes under legislation and assessed status based on lots of studies that had been done. And in 2015, Mark Zimbecki and John Wynarski and others, including myself, wrote a paper on what was happening with the declines and extinctions of mammal fauna in Northern Australia, and tabulated that again. Actually, short-beaked echidna is considered to not have actually occurred here, so we're sort of ignoring that one, but it's still there because. So how do we know these things? Well, monitoring is the way we pick up what's happening with anything really, whether it's a health issue or it's a fauna or a plant issue. General repeat fauna monitoring is required to pick up trends, so we can tell what's happening from the monitoring in the field. Most of that's general repeat monitoring in that we're not targeting a particular species, we're targeting whatever fauna are around. That might be mammals, reptiles, birds, frogs, vegetation, and so on. And you go back to the same place, periodically, whether it's every year or every 5 years or whatever, to pick up a signal about whether there's something happening. If there's a species that is of particular concern, like the black-footed tree rat or the northern quail or the Brachyl phascogale or something like that, then you can do some specific targeted monitoring and research to work out what's going on with species of concern. But the problem is that monitoring is actually absent from most of the savannas. And I'll get to that in a moment, but there are huge gaps in monitoring work that's being done. And recently there was a young statistical ecologist who examined the 20 odd years of reporting of faunal declines in the 3 parks of the Northern Territory, where there over 200 sites have been monitored for close to 30 years now. And what he found with others was that the confidence, that's the statistical confidence, that confidence interval of the statistical power, of the monitoring results, was only relevant to the most common and easily detected species. So we could pick up a signal of declines for those species which were of least concern to us. For any species that were less common, or indeed rare, or endangered, or critically endangered, we weren't picking up enough signal to be able to know what was happening until it had already happened. In other words, it's sort of like a before and after experiment. You've got a species here, and suddenly, 5 or 10 years later, it's gone. So we couldn't pick up what was happening, and that doesn't enable ecologists to do anything about what is happening. If you can't pick up a signal that something's happening to a species, you can't really take appropriate action for all sorts of reasons. But so we've got this real problem now that we've had the Northern Territory researchers have had to redesign their whole monitoring program to improve the statistical power of what they're finding. This has been found also in studies of the IUCN Red List category, that the statistical power is not great of a lot of the data. And the monitoring picture is the part of the problem, in that we don't have enough monitoring sites that are monitored frequently enough to be able to pick up signals. This map, the purple diamonds show the monitoring sites, and you'll notice the purple ones in the top end of the Northern Territory. They're the 3 parks, Kakadu, Nipmuc and Litchfield National Parks, which have been monitored for close to 30 years. They're the only long-term monitoring sites in the whole of the Savannah region. There are some just outside the Savannah region, which is where Glenda Wardle's been working for some considerable time. Then you see this cluster just just south of the Savannah region, and there's a small series of monitoring sites in the sort of the southeastern part of the Queensland savannas. That monitoring program, I understand, stopped in about 2014. So that was long term, but it's sort of declined. There's a bit in the wet tropics that's been pretty well covered in a lot of ways. And the ones over in the Kimberley here, they've only started in recent years, maybe a decade, maybe a bit more. So averting the crisis is really not so simple. Detecting declines is troublesome. There's no doubt about that. Getting the right statistics with the right data, sufficient data to be able to tell what's going on, is difficult. But even more difficult is determining the causes of declines. There have been many attempts at trying to understand the causes and the synergies among those causes. Blame has been apportioned to feral cats, to cane toads, changed fire regimes, overgrazing by cattle and other introduced and feral herbivores, changed ecological conditions. Weedy grasses in Northern Australia have become quite an issue. African and Asian and South American grasses have taken over some of the areas, particularly up in the Cape and parts of the Northern Territory. And they've changed fire regimes quite dramatically. So that's a serious problem. More recently, in more recent years, I should say, clearing in Northern Australia has increased. Queensland as a whole in 2018-19 lost 680,000 hectares to deforestation, and that trend seems to have continued despite the Vegetation Management Act. So it's become an issue in Northern Australia. We've got an overlaying factor of diseases which certainly affect species that are under stress already, and they can cause species to be under further stress. And then we've got 1.5. And 1.5 is the thing that has probably put the dampener on the recovery of spectacled flying fox. 1.5 degrees, we've already reached it in Northern Australia. It's the studies that have been done in the Gulf, in Darwin, in Cairns, are showing that the average temperature has already increased by around 1.5 degrees since records began. This is an image I took of the spectacled flying fox near Mareeba. just in February this year. There are about 10,000 species that we counted in one camp, which had not been recorded before. So that's a fair proportion of the population. And I'd like to finish on this note that we need to think about the future, and where do we think we're going to be in 2027, 2029 and 2032? Are we still going to be talking about the same sorts of declines in fauna across Northern Australia or the rest of Australia? In 2032, my granddaughter, Miller, will be 20. My grandson will be 18. His name's Dan. And I wonder if they, when they're starting uni, will be getting the same story that Australia's faunal extinction crisis continues unabated, and we've been reporting on it every few years, and it's simply got no better. Thank you.